Welcome to the AWS Direct Connect Solutions session and Network Automation. I'm Brian. I'm here with Roger and Brooke today. We're with Level 3. And we're going to be talking about not necessarily what Direct Connect is. We're assuming that everyone in the room here understands what private networking is into the cloud. But we're going to be talking about some specific use cases and reference architectures relative to Direct Connect, how to deploy it, and how to implement those solutions in a rational way. Those scenarios are going to encompass scaling, security, as well as continuity. So we'll talk about how to implement Direct Connect with those three scenarios. And we're also going to talk about the evolution of the network experience. So at Level 3, we're one of the top providers of Direct Connect around the world, offering support in more locations and more products, speeds, and feeds than any other provider. But we also recognize that the consumption of network services into the cloud needs to evolve. So in your traditional telecommunications service offering, you typically have a sales rep, you sign a contract, it's a 1, 2, 3-year term, and you're kind of stuck. It's a static kind of infrastructure. Well, as we are evolving the network into the cloud, we think it needs to be a little bit different. We think the network actually needs to be compliant and support the actual cloud infrastructure it's connecting to and have different consumption models. So it's an elastic network experience and you pay for the use. It's pay-for-use types of service offerings. So let's give you a little bit of insights into how we came up with that thesis and how we landed on this strategy. So obviously, we're seeing our customers accelerate in terms of cloud adoption. Everyone's here because they're either doing it, they're interested in it, and they're trying to find the most appropriate scenarios for their organizations and migration strategies. But through the course of that migration, we've also noticed that there's a convergence happening between private clouds or data centers, the network, and the cloud, and it's becoming a hybrid world, and we're having to deal with the pressures that are being put on the network, because typically that type of connectivity and traffic is very bursty. So at Level 3, we developed a specific set of network services we call Cloud Connect, and those network services have unique capabilities in terms of how customers can buy and use those network services into the cloud. And they tend to be, like I said, elastic and complement the scenarios that our customers are trying to achieve in terms of their migration. So how did the enterprise get there, and what's the path they're going down? A lot of our customers, obviously have been using our network services for a long time. And historically, 10 years ago, it was a walled garden, right? There were set IT assets and set locations. The network was very static. It connected these things together. But in today's world, with virtualization, security threats, the cloud adoption, things are becoming much more complex, with the added stress that many CIOs and IT professionals are being asked to be a lot more agile in their business. So we think as we start to look at the practice of designing network services in the enterprise, there is a core layer that kind of connects the big infrastructure inside the enterprise. There is a distribution layer that connects users and subscribers and remote offices into that core layer. And then there's an access layer that connects that infrastructure to the cloud partners and assets that those customers are trying to adopt and implement into their companies. So all of this kind of presents a number of different challenges for the customer. And what we're beginning to observe is that people started making this transition before they thought about the network, and things started falling apart. They started doing backups. They'd fail halfway through. They started seeing latency increase as they were trying to give access to their users for services that resided in the cloud. And they're coming to the conclusion, at least our customers are, that the network really matters, and they have to have a private infrastructure strategy relative to the network into the cloud. And that has to be a thoughtful strategy, right? It can't just be an afterthought. You actually have to plan for it. Again, back to the core distribution and access layers of the network from the enterprise. So think about that first. We're going to try to give you some insights today about our opinions and philosophies on that, how we think about it, and give you an end-to-end perspective on all those things we talked about from a convergence perspective, from the own data center to the network connecting, the fabric of that network connecting into the cloud, and how do we think about those things end-to-end. So with that, I'm going to let Roger talk a little bit about how to start to plan for some of those deployments.
Thanks, Brian. So there are a number of things that you have to take into consideration as you're thinking about how you're connecting into the cloud. Obviously, your business goals are the #1 priority. You want your IT strategy to be reflective of what your business initiatives are. You also want your network strategy to be reflective of what you're trying to achieve in the cloud. So depending on the type of application you're moving in the cloud, or that the different processes that you have running in the cloud, you might have different bandwidth requirements. For instance, VDI might be very different than a heavy big data analytics application. One might be multi-site connectivity with low bandwidth requirements. The other might be 1 or 2 primary data centers into your cloud, and you might need much bigger bandwidth requirements. Security and compliance are also important, whether it's the type of data that you're collecting or that you're managing, whether you're keeping that in a private network-attached storage or whether you've moved that into the cloud, but also what industry and regulatory compliance you might be subject to. And then what's your cloud migration strategy? Are you all in? Are you building apps natively in the cloud? Are you building hybrid apps where you're moving data back and forth, or running processes in both an on-prem or in a cloud environment? And then what are your needs? Are they local? Are they global? Do you have multi-site? Do you have multi-site in the US? Do you have offices in Europe, Asia Pacific? You need to be able to connect to your local cloud resources on a global basis. So one of the key characteristics that's critical for your cloud application and for cloud performance is really network consistency. So this table shows on the y-axis the different applications, and then across the x-axis the different network attributes. Everything from the bandwidth that you might need, how elastic it might be, to the type of consistency of performance, whether it's latency or jitter. So certain things like storage area networks and large VMs might require a lot of bandwidth. They might need to be very elastic, and they might need very consistent latency. Sometimes latency isn't just about being low latency, it's also about consistency. So certain applications certainly have latency tolerances depending on the IOPS intensity, and they may require really low latencies. But we're also finding our customers are, in fact, I was talking to one last night who was saying that sometimes as peak internet congestion or peak internet usage drives congestion and it starts slowing down their connection into the cloud, they're actually experiencing issues with their database where it fails to start writing the database. They can read information, but they can't write any new information. They have to go in and reboot the database. It brings their application down. It interrupts the customer experience, and obviously is not ideal. So there are a number of applications that are really sensitive to that network performance. But the funny thing about this chart is it's a little misleading because it's looking at the light blue areas are applications that are less sensitive to latency. However, the user experience is still highly sensitive. So email and web browsing, which were designed or built and just are very insensitive to they're very tolerant to changes in latency. However, if you're sitting there and you're trying to surf the web, or you're on a VoIP call and you experience jitter, it leads to a very sort of clunky and poor user experience. Security and compliance is the other critical component, and so this is really a multi-layered. It's really a multi-layered issue, and it's a shared responsibility. So there's everything from your cloud service provider and the various security features and capabilities that they offer, but it's also your network provider, and thinking about the network and securing your network from the edge. Think about the edge as the predictive layer the identification and the protection. So the network is a key component of that, and I'll talk about that in a second with some use cases. And then finally, there's the enterprise itself and the IT organization and having different security policies and procedures that they have to follow and best practices. So it's really a multi-layered approach, and it's definitely a shared responsibility. And you have to make sure that you're talking with your cloud service provider and with your network service provider to make sure you've got all the pieces of the puzzle put together. So we're going to talk about 3 specific use cases addressing security, scaling, and continuity. And I'm going to start off with a little bit about security. So this case is just a high-level scenario around internal applications. So assume that it's some back-office IT application. Perhaps it's ERP hosting. Maybe it's Exchange. Maybe it's a SharePoint site, or it could be an Oracle or SAP implementation. So you're using a mission-critical app. You've got sensitive information that you're choosing to put into the cloud. You might be dealing with large volumes of information. So this is really 3 axes that you have to think about. One is security, one is performance, and the other is efficiency. So in this case, you might have multiple sites all accessing AWS, and the obvious, easiest way for an initial deployment, or perhaps a burst, or for bursty applications, would be public internet. There are a few challenges with the public internet. So first, you're running encryption across the public internet if you're moving sensitive information. So you've got to set up multiple VPN tunnels from different locations. And as you start adding new applications, you might have to have multiple tunnels and certificates. You might also be having your customer prem device where you've got a firewall that you're operating on your on-prem location. So you're dealing with multiple devices across multiple locations. And then you've got your remote users as well that you have to manage. Then if you're moving large volumes of information in and out of the cloud, you've got the additional burden of what's the performance of that workload. Is it moving fast enough? Is it efficiency? Are you getting the right effective throughput? And if you're moving data out, what's your cost? So as many of you know, when you're moving large workloads out of the cloud, you're charged on egress data transfer. So sometimes a private connection can be less expensive. And then finally, the internet is best effort. So if you're dealing with mission critical applications and you've got end users that need to access these applications like I was talking before, internet might be insufficient. So a couple ways that you could do this is through a private cloud connection. You might have either dedicated or VPN connectivity. This will give you some potential improved security because you're consolidating or you're containing all of these private applications over a finite number of connections. And so you don't have to worry about all the different ports that you might be opening up to the internet. You're actually containing it. You're creating a bit of a walled garden just for these types of applications. We were actually talking with a customer a couple months ago, and they were saying that prior to using Direct Connect, they were using the public internet, and they had some developers that were moving production environments into AWS over an open port to the public internet, and it violated all of their security policies, and they had no idea it was happening because they were just using this publicly accessible IP port. So they implemented the Direct Connect so that they wanted to maintain the flexibility for their developers, but they wanted to give them some control so that they remain compliant with their InfoSec policies. So the other thing that you get here is you can use network-based firewall, which takes advantage of a large network and its ability to understand the potential threat landscape and can offer improved detection and prevention. You might also you'll get more efficient transmission of data because you get guaranteed throughput and you get fixed latency. So you know what that latency number is the moment you set up the connection. You know that latency is never going to change. And then there's also two-factor remote access management to manage your BYOD scenario. So it's just it's a more secure, it's a higher performance network solution, and it's more efficient from a data transmission perspective, especially for large workloads. And then there's also new services available, and this is a network solution architecture that we just rolled out this week in partnership with Cisco and AWS. And this is about secure enterprise-grade hybrid workloads. So this is using Level 3 Cloud Connect solutions to connect your enterprise wide area network with AWS through Direct Connect. And then it's using the Cisco Cloud Services Router 1000V, which provides end-to-end encryption using IPsec over that direct connect pipe. So one of the differentiators of the Cisco CSRV, which is available in the AWS Marketplace, is that it actually works at much higher speeds than many other VPN software. So it's offering gig and multi-gig support. And it also, if you're using a Cisco-based router in your network, it'll propagate automatically those security policies on your on-prem environment up into the AMI. And with that, I'll hand it back to Brian.
Thank you. So the next use case we're going to talk about is business scaling. So in terms of what is it, obviously customers typically have resources, assets inside their own private data center. They want to not necessarily forklift and replace those, but they want to augment them. So they're leveraging the cloud to scale out that infrastructure into a provider like AWS. And so what we have here is a use case that involves, obviously, we're going into the holiday season. An online retailer is going to be spinning up a lot of marketing efforts at this time of the year, and they're probably going to want to be able to deal with that demand, and they're going to want to scale out their web services tier so that they can support all the customer inquiries coming into that environment. So when we're designing the network and the cloud around that, we have to have some design considerations, and we have to be thinking about certain things to ensure that we've got enough capacity, we can support the number of hits into the web services tier, and we're providing the right amount of governance and security between eyeballs coming into the AWS domain and back to whatever those resources, ERP, inventory, or any type of PCI compliance inside of the customer environment. So how do you do that? So there's a couple of different things you need to be thinking about. From the left side in the AWS world, you actually have to kind of whiteboard this stuff before you start implementing it. Obviously, you want everything inside of a VPC, but then you need to think about how are you going to bifurcate your actual hosts and your web servers from those users who are coming into that environment. So you want to come up with an IP address and subnetting scheme that says, I've got private side and I've got public side. The public side are going to be attached to the internet gateway that give the subscribers access and visibility into that environment. And the private side is going to be connected to the virtual gateway that's connected to the direct connect that goes back to the data center. So you're setting that environment up inside the VPC, protecting those environments, and then you're setting up route tables and security groups in between those so that you're controlling how that traffic flows and what it has access to. On the network side, you're obviously connecting your direct connect port to a VLAN or layer 2 services that connects back to the customer environment. And you want to be sure that you're not overpaying for those services. So you want to set up an amount of capacity that is supporting the average daily usage that's going on between those two environments. But as the marketing campaigns hit, as the television ads hit, right, and the inquiries start to go way up, and the hits go up on the website services tier, that capacity starts to expand. And so we have a service that we implement typically with our customers that's called dynamic capacity. And what it allows the customer to do is they can subscribe to a committed amount of bandwidth, and then they can put business rules in place that say if these certain events happen, certain utilizations are hit, take that bandwidth and expand it so that I don't have any contention between my web services tier back into the OSS and the back office for that environment. So that's one of the more common use cases that we see where customers are trying to scale up inside the cloud, but there's also connectivity, and they need to think about how they're designing that end-to-end solution for a scale-out scenario. The next use case we're going to talk about is continuity.
Yep. Thanks, Brian. So, in a BCDR scenario, this is arguably the most popular one right now for those enterprise customers who are starting to think about using the cloud in a more serious way than tinkering or dev test. It's one of the first ones that they decide they want to do. Key reason for that is in the old world of BCDR, it was a 2x scenario, right? So I'm going to replicate my compute, my storage, the code versions, the whole stack, and I'm going to do it twice somewhere else. And it was obviously very expensive. So when cloud starts to come of age, it's very attractive to start thinking about using that so that you can scale up and pay only for what you use in those moments of crisis in a disaster recovery, which in many cases never actually happen, right? I'm sure it never happens to anybody here. So, putting those elements together, there's a couple of key problems when you decide to do BCDR in the cloud. So, first is the performance aspect, right? And I think you've heard it 3 or 4 times here that Direct Connect is an answer to that, and obviously AWS had a lot of foresight and is certainly ahead of the market in that. And so that one to some degree addresses it, but you certainly, if you're going after a production BCDR scenario, you do not want to tell your CIO that you're hoping that the internet will be good enough when things go wrong, right? So Direct Connect is a powerful tool for that. The second problem with it is that the network buying behavior is inconsistent with the activities that occur throughout the life cycle of BCDR. And I'll walk through kind of, just making it up to some degree what those life cycle moments are in BCR, right? So with those in mind, the life cycle that BCDR goes through, you have to think about the very first stage when you're going to implement a hybrid strategy with the cloud. And the first stage is, I've got a lot of information, legacy information sitting in the old environment, and I'm going to have to move it into the new. It's a migration, a very typical one, right? And this can vary wildly, right? We heard yesterday from MLB that apparently they do 17 petabytes every season. My guess is that most of us probably have something smaller, but it's not unreasonable to assume that you might have, say, 100 terabytes sitting in the legacy environment that you need to move over. And so this presents an opportunity. You heard both of these guys talking about the network buying needing to shift from very traditional term-based options, very static options. But what you have here is a migration. I'm going to do it one time, and really after that, I'm done, right? Until I move on to the second phase. So what you need is something that we like to call, I'm sure it's very creative, dynamic connections. And so a dynamic connection is generally based around a job, right? It's not based around a time frame or arbitrary pricing or sizes and things like that. It says, you've got 100 terabytes, I have to move it over here, whether you need to do it in the next 24 hours or you could do it maybe in the next 60 days. The network service that you want to purchase in an alternate model of how you consume network is based on that 100 terabytes, not based on a rate limit or a term or anything like that. So when I move those over, go ahead and just turn it off, or maybe I'll give you the equivalent of a cell package, right? Cell minutes package, right? With overage fees if you exceed that 100 terabytes, for example. So that's one case where not all network buying is consistent. The second phase of BCDR is once I've got the synchronization of the two environments, now I'm going to go into a more, just an ongoing keep alive mode, right? So I'm looking to ensure that the change management from the original environment gets synchronized with the new one. And so there's lots of tools that are used. I saw Zerto on the floor, right, that can handle the RPO, RTOs between those. Or you might use AWS Storage Gateway so that your old environment thinks that it's talking to tape drives, right? Either way, that is typically a much smaller bandwidth intensive application during the middle life cycle than the previous one, right? In a migration, if I'm moving 100 terabytes, again, just kind of making up the speeds, but that might require 150, 200 megs to get it done in the next 30 days. For the next several years, while I'm doing change management, you're really just pushing relatively small changes up to the cloud to synchronize it, right? Instead of 100 terabytes, you're talking about 100K, right? Maybe it's a few hundred times a day, but that's still much smaller, right? So in this case, here's an example where what all of you love us network providers so much for is those static terms, and you have to sign all the paperwork and this and that. But this is one where that's actually relevant, right? So that type of buying behavior absolutely does not go away. During the life cycle of this, it's very standard and probably ideal or optimized for you to have a very traditional termed service that's relatively small, right? The third piece of the life cycle is the one that everyone hopes and prays does not happen, but it's when something goes horribly wrong, right? And so, you know, if you have a good IT corporate citizens, maybe it never happens, but you have to assume that it might, right? And when you have a disaster occurring, there's lots of different ways that that could happen. So it could be, you know, your old environment is isolated, but the rest of your content can be reached from the cloud that you've been backing up to. It might also be a catastrophic loss of data or information, right? It could be all 100 terabytes that you originally backed up. Maybe if you've been pushing changes up to it for the last several years, it's now 200 terabytes. It might only be a portion of it that you've lost, say maybe 50 terabytes. The bottom line in that scenario is you've got to back that up. You've got to push it back to your old environment as quickly as possible. And now all of a sudden that 10 meg service that you had sitting there is not adequate, right? So the third type of buying behavior was what we call dynamic capacity, and I think Brian referenced that. And that's where I say, I just want you to temporarily take the one you've already got and push it up until I get the data I need back out of the cloud and into the original environment. So there are a couple of other ways you could do this, right? We have seen certain customers, they want to buy a separate service, right? That's a larger pipe that's off to the side that is not used for this. You know, in many cases, it may feel more resilient, but you're spending a lot of money on a service you probably will never use, right? Crossing your fingers. And you also are not entirely sure that it's going to work, right? So if your IT shop is doing the right thing, they're going to test failover every once in a while periodically with BCDR and make sure that things flow over to the right circuits. But in that moment of crisis, you don't know because you weren't using it, right? But that 10 meg service you were using on a constant basis because you had information pushing up to the cloud. So use the dynamic capacity. This is another buying behavior that remains on that 10 meg service and pushes up temporarily. Now you could also take that one step further and apply additional business rules to it that would say, I only want you to increase that throughput if you see a sudden increase, a massive increase of throughput coming from the opposite direction, from the AWS side, right? In that event, I want you to bump it up here or here, you know, wherever you think is appropriate. And then I want you to leave it there until you see X number of minutes where the utilization has dropped down below X%, right? And so you set those business rules kind of according to your tolerances, and that is what we would term alert-driven dynamic capacity. So it's simply writing some intelligence into that network and allowing you to set business rules against it instead of relying on kind of, you know, traditional protocols and settings and, you know, things like that, right? So across those three, there's dynamic connections, there's kind of more traditional term services, and there's dynamic capacity. The point being, again, that we're driving home is that not all network buying experiences are created equal, that there is a methodology to those, and especially if you have the appropriate carrier selected for those activities, that is very driven by the use case, right? It's not an all, you know, not every network service should be termed. Not every network service should be usage only or pay for what you use. It's highly dependent, right? So what we wanted to do is we're going to show you a quick example of the first examples of dynamic connections. So, yeah.
So for a little bit of context, so at level 3 today, we have the dynamic capacity product in market. So we have customers who are flexing that bandwidth up and down depending on their requirements and the use case. And we're preparing to introduce this notion of dynamic connections in the first quarter. So we'll be looking for some beta customers here in December. We'll be trialing this service. But this is our aspirational goal, to drive this experience online, right? And to essentially, instead of, you know, buying network services in a classic framework, how can we give the power, the control, the visibility to our customers? How can we give that to them and allow them to self-service, instantiate networks, bring them up, tear them down, flex them up and down? And what would that look like? So this notion of a platform is really taking that Cloud Connect portfolio and driving this online experience and the self-service capability that we want to introduce to the market.
So we're going to look at a real specific example, and we're going to skip over a lot of things. I encourage you to come by our booth if you'd like to see more details around this. So you'll note that I'm going to skip a lot of stuff, right? Secondary, this is a live demo, so I've already had a couple people tell us you're crazy for trying that, but cross our fingers and we reserve the right? So, what we're going to do here is we're going to use what we call a wizard. So just another kind of vision statement is the notion of having our enterprise customers purchase network services more based around the questions that are most relevant to their business, rather than, if you've ever had the pleasure of buying network services, going through lots of technical documentation and filling out lots of spreadsheets and things like that, right? It's how can I distill that down to the simplest form possible and still get a live service delivered the way that they expected it to be delivered. And the second piece that'll happen here is I have the Direct Connect console. Hopefully most of you recognize this, pulled up, because what we do is, much like a service orchestration tool with the credentials from the customer, I'm also going to create all of the necessary components for the Direct Connect to be built on the spot. And so the reason that we do that is we have infrastructure ports already in place that allow us to do that, right? So if you've ever ordered Direct Connect, the traditional method is you go and get I call it the permission slip, right? It's an LOA CFA, but it says, I have permission to plug this into over here, right, to AWS. If I already have that plugged in, though, now I can automate a lot more of those activities on the customer's behalf, right? So let me set it up a little bit. This is the Direct Connect console, and what we're doing right now is we are looking at the Direct Connect virtual interfaces. So if you've built a Direct Connect before, you know that you have a port, here's the physical port, and then I build interfaces with VLANs and things like that, right? And it'll set up my IP settings and other things, right? And at the moment I'm in this region, Northern California. We also call it West 1, okay? So at the moment I do not have any virtual interfaces, and actually I cheated a little bit because I filtered by Denver, because this is a live port, so we have some customers and we don't want to embarrass them. Let you see them. So this is the landing page, and what we're going to do is we're going to go to what we call the Design Center.
So if I could, I mean, this is very specific to the AWS use case, connecting into AWS cloud. But our vision is really, how do we start to make these part of our ecosystem and active nodes? So what we're really talking about here is we have connectivity established whereby we've already procured the ports from AWS. We've binded that to our network through a cross-connect. We have infrastructure in place, and we call those destinations. So they could be any cloud provider. And since we've built up that infrastructure, they're active nodes, right? They're active nodes on the network so that we can provision to those instantaneously. And so that's kind of the vision of where we're trying to take what I called earlier, the cloud networking business, that access element of networking from your data centers into your various different cloud partners. How can we present that to our customers and make it very usable? And so this is our first iteration. And if you have feedback for us, we'd love to hear it, because we've been developing this with a small group of developers and customers, and we'd love to kind of get your perspective on it, if it's the right methodology, or if there's a different view or something that's more interesting from your perspective.
So this has been filtered for AWS, since we are at an AWS conference, but what this represents is all of the physical ingest points that we can grab traffic from an enterprise customer and feed it into one of their regions, and domestically here, right, in the US. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a wizard menu. And so again, conceptually, I kind of mentioned the concept of a wizard. So Microsoft Word and the paperclip dancing around, ours is a lot less annoying, but the concept is still the same, right? Is ask a couple of questions that are relevant to their business need, right? And so we're going to use, not surprisingly, the dynamic connection wizard, but you can think of many other scenarios, the TCO modeling, which is very important to many enterprises, right? Build a wizard around that would result in certain services being built to the spec that to the tolerances they set, right? So we're going to go to the dynamic connection wizard, And I almost always forget, I'm going to, West 1 is what we are on, right? So I'm going to select this as my ALOC. I'm going to go to the next. And now it's asking me for my enterprise location. And so to set that context, this is going into, dipping into inventory, and it's going to look and say what ports are eligible for this instant connection out of that customer's inventory, right? So these two ports actually happen to be the data centers that we set up to do the boot camps earlier in the week, for those of you who may have attended some of those. So we helped AWS and set some of those up, and so we're using the same ports that they were using in those boot camps, right? And I want to use my Denver data center. So now here, don't get hung up over the prices. They're not real. But the principle or the concept is, as I mentioned, think of it at some level like cell minutes, right, with an overage. So I say I have a 5 terabyte workload. I need to move over this. So I would pick this one. And if for whatever reason I decide, I miscalculated and it's 6 terabytes, there's your overage fee, right, for those gigs that you go over that limit. This is redacted down to only those technical details that I cannot already gather from my own, either my own services when I go and build my, the blue line here, right? That's on our WAN network, or that I cannot derive from the customer's account. And then finally, if you've done Direct Connect before, you'll know that you have to have what they call a virtual gateway built, right, in order to attach it to. And so what this is doing is using those credentials for the customer that I showed you here a moment ago. It goes in and it says, okay, at the West 1 region, what virtual gateways are eligible for me to terminate to? And we created these two for this purpose, right? So I'll select the first one. I'll move on to the next. I'll give it a name. And I will create the connection. Okay, so what this is going to do is it's going to go out and it's going to build an EVC. For those who are not really excited about network stuff, that is a layer 2 term. It's a service. It's based on a VLAN, so it's a tunnel that goes from that point, the 2 points that you saw on the map there. And then in the Amazon console, it's going to build that virtual interface, and it's going to assign IP addressing and things like that. And so here's the big moment. Cross our fingers. Boom. All right, so it is pending. So it is being built right now. And typically, my guess is we will not be sitting here waiting for it, because Amazon, what their service does is it goes and pushes this config to their router, right? And it takes anywhere from 2 to 10 minutes, right? So, but the point is, it is there, right? Now, what would happen after this is it would come, the physical line would come up, but it would be showing down, because I would then have to take the IP addressing they assign and put it on my router in the Denver data center, right? And I'm not going to bore you by going through Cisco configs and whatnot, right? So that's the demonstration, and really, the purpose of it is, again, to suggest that dynamic connections are relevant for certain things, especially migration jobs. And I think secondarily, if you've ever done Direct Connect before from scratch, you know that it is a fairly arduous process, right? A good chunk of our customers need quite a bit of assistance with it. And so we're trying to find as many ways as possible to make that easy on them. And I believe this is quite a bit more easy than the current Direct Connect process, right? So we've worked pretty closely with AWS on some of this, and really excited about this piece. Closing.
So if you wouldn't mind going back to the search menu, and just, you don't have to show the logos, but just all the other points of clearing the filters are. So we are very focused on AWS here, and this is, again, a service that we're going to be taking to market. Can you show all the locations? In the near future. But the idea here is that we are trying to get our overall ecosystem in place so that, like I said, you're designing core and distribution networks as you always had and have in your traditional environment. But the cloud access piece starts to be delivered via this kind of interface. So you can see here we have a whole lot of those, quote, active nodes, and those are all the data centers and all the cloud providers that sit on our network. So those are destinations that we have that are in production that you can sort and search against and find out who's the right partner for you, how can you connect to those services. And then there's a lot of things that happen in the background that Brooke was talking about that are very technical in nature that we start to abstract away from the customer. So we are working with the various different cloud providers to reach out via API calls to collect information about customer accounts, to do OAuth so we have authorization to actually do things on behalf of the customer and make the activation of these services a lot easier. So compare and contrast that to the world today, which is Direct Connect takes 45 to 60 days to turn up. And it takes a lot of coordination and orchestration between your team, probably the data center you're going to. You have to buy that cross connect. You have to get the LOA CFA. You have to deploy techs to test things in real time. So it's a very, it's the incumbent process that is not very well aligned with any cloud use case. So this is our objective, is to try to put these things in play and to make them available for customers and take a lot of the pain out of that cloud networking process diagram that's today's default standard. Are there any questions?
A couple minutes for questions.
Do you have applications outside the US?
So
not currently.
We are part of a very recent acquisition. So this represented the older company. Level 3 does have a worldwide presence, and so that is a very quick follower, right? It is our intention is. No, we're level 3.
So to be clear, this represents the legacy TW Telecom E-Link service, right? But Level 3 does offer the global Direct Connect locations.
So we are integrating the portfolios together. This is a go-forward strategy for the organization. We intend to deploy the network architecture globally and then start to add on some of the capabilities that we're representing here in North America, in EMEA and LATAM and other places.
Other questions? All righty.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.